All right, here's the third of these videos. We're going to talk about constitutionalism. England, let's talk about Magna Carta, which I believe the year was 1215. This is like the beginning of it. This is a contextualization, uh, meaning that, this is obviously preparing you for an LEQ or a DBQ, which we're not going to have this year. But the test is supposedly going to be a process test, so they might ask you questions about contextualization. So at this point, we're not going to ignore anything. So way back in 1215, before AP European even begins, the study of, there was a British king named King John who basically was forced to sign an agreement with his nobles saying he wouldn't raise taxes unless he got their permission. There was a history of common law. They had a parliament there. They grew up the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And I think of the House of Lords as our Senate, which of course you can be a commoner in this country and be in the Senate or the House of Representatives. But I think of them as being based on that because the English wrote, Americans of English descent wrote our Constitution. It was a capitalist society. In England, you had the Anglicanism, that's the Church of England versus the Catholics. And then the Puritans got in on it. The Puritans technically should have been in with the Anglicans because they were Protestants, but the Puritans thought that the Anglicans were too Catholic. Remember, that's why they were trying to get out of there and they moved to Massachusetts in the Great Puritan migrations. Elizabeth I, very important as far as constitutionalism, she was a politique. If you remember, she was Henry VIII's daughter with Anne Boleyn, and who had been king just before her was Bloody Mary, or queen. When Henry VIII died, his boy, the one I always forget, at the moment I can't remember his name, Edward VI, I believe. I may not be right about the number, but he had this boy who was devoutly Protestant who did not rule very long and died. Then he had Mary Tudor, who goes down in history as Bloody Mary, who was devoutly Catholic, and then came her, and remember, she was married to Philip II, the most Catholic monarch of Spain. And so, interesting story here, but then comes Elizabeth, and Elizabeth said, I'm the head of the Church of England, like my father was, but her thing was you could be Catholic or Protestant. Their official thing was that we're Protestant, we're Anglican, but as long as, you don't annoy me or whatever, as long as you're not too public about it, we're going to allow it to exist. And so she kind of took a middle rule, and what happens with her is the so-called Golden Age. Golden Age of England is Elizabethan England. That is the time of Shakespeare and all that. And she was religiously tolerant. Moving on. Okay, we're really getting into, we're backing up here. I don't really know why. Talking about the English Revolution, and they've got this under the heading of constitutionalism. All right, so I'm just going to tell you what happened. We're not backing up because after Elizabeth I dies, remember she is called the Virgin Queen because she never married. When she died, there was no body in line to take over. She didn't have any children. So they went to James I up in Scotland and invited him to come down and be king. So he was James VI of Scotland at the same time he was James I of England. And he's a divine right guy, and he's a Catholic. And then he died, and his son came. His son was Charles I, and he went to war with Scotland, his father's country. And this gets really complicated. Remember, English Civil War is one of the most complicated topics in AP European history. And basically, to make a long story short, because we may do a whole thing on the English Civil War later on, he gets into it with Parliament. And so there's a war called the English Civil War between the Roundheads and the Cavaliers and the Roundheads. And the Cavaliers supported the king, and the Roundheads supported the Parliament. The Roundheads won. They chopped the king's head off. And this is, 100 years before, over 100 years before the French cut their king's head off. So the French were not the first to do this. They cut off their king's head, and Oliver Cromwell ruled during this time. It's got several names: the Interregnum, the Commonwealth. There's another phrase. And Oliver Cromwell ruled basically as a Puritan dictator. And then when he died, he tried to pass it to his son, which meant he was really trying to set up a monarchy as well. And so what they happen is they bring back another Stuart. Now, the Tudors died with Elizabeth the First, but these guys, this new dynasty is called the Stuarts. And even though James the First was the first, and the second one was his son Charles the First, that's the one they executed. Charles the First's brother was still alive over in France. And they invited him to come back. And he's James the Second. A lot of people fascinated with him. And I'm sorry, he's Charles the Second. And then he dies, and James the Second takes over. And James the Second has a child who's going to be raised as the Protestant. So we go through James the First, Charles the First, Charles the Second, and then James the Second. And under James the Second, who is apparently going to veer the country back towards Catholic control, the English are just very tired of it. And so they have this thing called the Glorious Revolution. And they invite the Dutch monarchs, William and Mary, to come over. Or they may not be Dutch monarchs, but they're royalty over in the Netherlands. Remember, there's this tie in between them. They invite them to come and become king and queen. And that is the Glorious Revolution. James II is not killed. I think he goes into exile in France. And they bring in William and Mary. And what's interesting is Mary is James II's daughter, and she's married to her first cousin, William. You know, it's like they're from one of these American states I won't mention. Anyway, when they come over, there's basically a deal cut between Parliament, William and Mary, saying, we're going to let you guys come over here and be king and queen, but you're going to give us rights. And they pass this thing called the English Bill of Rights. This is a big deal. They basically, and this is when it's settled once and for all, that the English king and queen are subordinate to the Parliament. And so this is really the history of constitutionalism, when they have this English Bill of Rights. And our American Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, if you read them, are very similar to the English Bill of Rights. Okay, this is very important. Moving on. All right, going to go through this stuff kind of quickly. What was the old, this is cultural stuff. What was the old regime society like? Land equaled power. A lot of stuff came down from feudalism. The aristocratic elites inherited their privileges. They established churches, and the churches are associated with state nobles, which means when we get to Unit 3, the church is seen as being allied with the powers that have been. And that's why the church is always, and still is in many ways, considered to be a conservative institution. Some of the new stuff they get, you start to have these things called guilds, which are somewhat like unions, but these are skilled labor associations. Again, a guild, the concept of a guild would be a good SAQ question. They're urban labor organizations, and they're basically like silversmiths. And let's see, the rural peasants and serfs are subject to high taxes and feudal dues. Moving on. The aristocrats try to, take their power back. I don't have a whole lot to say about this slide, so you can pause it and write it down. Obviously, if it's part of your classwork grade or homework. Homework and classwork are basically the same thing, the way I'm grading now. Moving on. Same kind of deal here. You can just pause it and write this down. Okay, on this slide, there's some very important stuff here. What's interesting is the two countries that have the agricultural revolution are also the same two countries that have constitutionalism, the Dutch and the English. And the Dutch, remember, have this engineer named Vermuyden, Vermuyden. And the Dutch for years, I don't know what country this is to the right here in the picture here, but it could be England. It looks like England. I've been there. It could also be the Netherlands. Remember, a large chunk of the Netherlands is under sea level. And so the Dutch had, for centuries, manipulated their environment. Anyway, let's go over some of these innovations here. Because I might give you an SAQ and say, list some of the agricultural innovations. They would have different fields and they would rotate crops. Some crops suck out the nutrients from the soil. Other crops put them back in, like clover, puts nutrients back into the soil. They learned how to drain the fields better. There were new crops. I know cotton, for instance, which was grown in the American South, was known for sucking all the nutrients out. It was a very damaging crop. There's new fertilizers. One of the most number one fertilizers in the history of the world is animal manure. And I always tell the story about black cow. There's the seed drill, which I believe was invented by Jethro Tull. Instead of just throwing seed down on the ground where a bird can come by and eat it, you drill it down into the soil. Selective breeding, I corrected the spelling in one of these copies of this lecture, but apparently not this one. Obviously, it's B-R-E-E. Selective breeding is where if you want characteristics in the animal, you breed them with other animals, other, specimens with the same characteristics. And in AP World, when I teach this, I show this video I have of foxes. Somebody took these wild foxes and they started taking the friendlier ones and breeding them. And after 26 generations of breeding the friendliest foxes together, they have these foxes. And again, I believe this is in the Netherlands where this has been done. They are basically like dogs. They're house pets, and they're the cutest things you've ever seen. What are the effects? They have the enclosure movement. Now, remember, this happens in England, where the rich people pester the parliament saying, hey, we've got all this common land, and we're using, you can see there on the right, I guess that's a primitive tractor up there. We're spending all this money for this equipment. We can't have the common people out there messing around. So they encouraged Parliament, who passed a law allowing them to enclose their lands. Whereas before, poor people could wander out and plant on this common land. Now they've been shut off. And so, remember we did the urban game, many of these people are forced to go to the cities. And what's being built in the cities? Industry, and that's where they go. So there's a huge change in their lifestyle. What are the effects of all these things? There's more food, population growth. There you see it there, the end of commons. That means the common land. And urbanization, moving to the cities. Next slide. The cottage industry, aka the domestic or putting out system. Oh, this is a great graphic. And this is very likely to be an SAQ for somebody. Cotton merchant takes his cotton out to the spinners' cottages. They spin it, they send it to the weavers' cottages. And then what happens is, a week later, the merchant comes back and he picks up the finished cloth and he takes it back to his factory in the city, and they make shirts out of it. And the textile industry uses this. And there's a couple things that are going on. A lot of these people working in these cottages are women who are staying home with children. Remember, I spent a lot of time on this. And anyway, what they're doing is by bringing the English government and these other, it's not just the English doing this, but primarily we're talking about England. They have all these new standards now, rules you have to start to follow. And if you, allow the peasants to do this on their own time, they can get around these rules. So the merchants were giving it to these mainly women who stayed at home. And the women liked this work because they could raise their kids and make a salary. So if you look at it that way, it's a win-win. The merchant, it's a win all the way around, most people believe. The merchant gets to do this, have this done cheaper. These women staying home with kids get to raise their kids and have a salary. And now that the merchant has saved money, he can sell this finished clothing at a cheaper price, which means poor people who need clothes have cheaper clothes. It's kind of like the Walmart deal, where a lot of people hate Walmart. Walmart does pay their employees low amounts, but it's also very inexpensive stuff. So the fact that Walmart exists benefits a lot of poorer people. Here's some inventions: the spinning jenny, the flying shuttle, the water frame. The steam engine is the biggest invention, the most important invention maybe in the history of the world. I would like to think electricity, which is not an invention, it's a discovery. Or the computer is more important, but apparently not. Iron smelting is another one. So the spinning jenny, the flying shuttle, and the water frame, they might be SAQs. You might need to look those up. And I am going to pause this video. And this will be the end of part 3.